it doesn't mean that you need to know the struggle to understand the struggle, to be able to help educate people and say, we are better than this as human beings.
Let me back up a second. So many of the kids I went to school with, I went to a parochial school. They were brutal. This is in the 70s. A Vietnam vet, Army drill sergeant was the principal.
Wow.
We would get beaten. I don't know. I'd take a beating about twice a week. Put you over the chair, big paddle with holes in it, beat the hell out of you for the smallest things. You'd get demerits if you looked. We had desks that we sat at, and if you looked up over the desk, you'd get a demerit, and 3 demerits got you 15 minutes, and 5 and 6 demerits would get you an hour, and you'd stand against a white wall for an hour without moving, with your nose this far away from it. So that was, and I was a troublemaking kid, and I was a street kid, and all of these other things, and so my childhood was that, and then stealing food to eat at the same time, and taking buses, and just, violence and multiple murders and lots of suicides and drug abuse and all the rest of those things. I am who I am in spite of and because of where I come from. And I'm worried that the message is that you can't become anything because of where you come from. That seems like the message that is out there, and it discounts all of the issues, not to downplay your history, but to encourage is the wrong word. It just seems like we are telling our kids nothing's possible. We're telling our kids that you can't do those things that you want to do. And I'm spend all my time on this podcast telling people that I had it as ugly as anybody else did, and I did. And there were some very specific things that I did to make that happen. I went to work every day, right? I didn't get into debt. I bought a house. I did some very specific things that helped pull me out of that, work ethic being number one. But that's, for me, that's the part that scares me, and the part that worries me is just the message, which is slavery was bad. You guys did it. We're feeling the effects of it. And I'd like to go, guilty as charged. I can't imagine. Terrible. But what are we doing in 2020, right? Where if a black or a Asian or whatever walked in my door, they'd be hired within minutes. It doesn't matter. I mean, we just don't see it. That's more of the world that I see today than even when I was a kid in the 70s, right? We went to see, I'm a huge Dodger fan. We went to see 42. This is 10 years ago. And my kids they're 23, 21, and 19. So they're young teens into single digits. And I said, guys, we're going to go to this movie. It's an important movie to go to. God, it was a good movie. I loved it. Important movie to go to. But you're going to hear language that you're not used to hearing, in particular, the N-word.
Right.
And I've never been prouder, Alan, because they said, what's the N-word? And so I had to tell them what the word was. They never heard the word before.
You had to expose them. I'm sorry.
Yes, I had to expose them to that word. But I was 2 parts on that. Number one, I was proud of myself. They'd never heard that word, because I heard that word a million times growing up, right? On the other side, I was able to tell them what that word meant, and they were able to come at it with what I think is the approach that we would all like, the horribleness of it. Your take on it and my take on it's very different because we're older, but for these young, fresh minds, they really did this? And I said, well, let's go watch the movie, where if you've seen the movie with Jackie Robinson.
I did not get to see it, but you brought it up because I know you probably heard the gentleman that did that, Chadwick Boseman, passed away.
Yes.
And just the fact that he encompassed, he played him, and then he played the Black Panther character. Then he also played James Brown in another movie. So the fact that you're mentioning him is like a perfect example. He had to carry the weight of telling that story.
You have to go see it, or don't go see it. Rent it.
Yeah, rent it. Yeah.
And they did not pull any. I mean, there's no way to accurately reflect what he went through, but they really tried not to pull any punches. So much so that I was glad that I set that up for my kids because they thought it was just horrific. And I think that That is more the circles that I am aware of. That is more the reality of the people in and around me, from businesses to friends, that we just don't see the world the way that we get accused of seeing the world.
Well, number one, kudos to you for having a conversation with your children. And I think that's probably what I think you and I, again, maybe I'll blame, not blame myself, but I'll say to myself as well, I maybe don't see oftentimes what other people have seen in the culture, because I also was raised in a way, well, I was raised that you actually had it way harder than I did. I mean, my dad, thank God, was able to get a good job, be a dentist and everything. And so I really grew up as like this suburban kid. So I never had those struggles. So I oftentimes looked at some of my friends growing up and I was like, well, what's going on with you? Because I get home and I have a square meal, and, my mom and dad are married, and, they love each other, and just like, Brady Bunch kind of family. Or I should say Cosby kind of family back then, the whole thing. So I actually felt at times that I didn't understand the meaning of struggle and the meaning of, when I read about these history lessons, they didn't apply to me. I felt kind of out of touch. And what I think I've learned now, what you're kind of explaining, is it doesn't mean that you need to know the struggle to understand the struggle, to be able to help educate people and say, we are better than this as human beings. That is the key, I think, that I do catch on to. And the fact that your friends and the people in your circle have, I would say, have an elevated view of this is something we want to encourage. The only scary part now is, again, not to push back at all, but just to say where the danger is when that, and I'm saying to myself too, when that higher consciousness becomes an assumption that that's just the way the world works. Because, as you and I both know, there's evil in the world. There's people who have never changed their mindsets. There's people who continually spout victimhood. I kind of caught on to that a little bit when you said, well, people think nothing is possible, that victim mentality. That's dangerous in every culture. And I do feel that oftentimes, again, apologies to anyone in my race that feels that I'm speaking against the Black leadership or whatever you want to call it. But there has been a victimhood mentality that has been pushed, I think, on in African-American culture. That doesn't go in my family. I'll tell you right there, because you heard my story. Mm-hmm. You heard how my grandmother and my mother and my father have all pushed beyond whatever racism tried to do to them and never accepted the victim mentality. So I don't accept it. I don't believe that my children are going to be held back. And even if they were held back, I'm not going to give them the excuse. But that doesn't mean that those invisible barriers don't arise. And again, it doesn't mean that the entire culture has created them, but unfortunately, we have to deal with them now and again. And that's what I think the key is that recognizing it when it shows up, just like you recognize you had to talk about the N-word, recognizing that this was a movie that was worth watching, and you didn't say to yourself, well, it's time for Black history. Let's watch 42. I don't feel that was your attitude. And kind of go back to where the whole point about whether or not it's being shoved down your throat, or Black Lives Matter being shoved down our throat, or the players doing all these things. And, wherever it shows up in culture, I believe that we have to draw back and say, okay, what's the purpose of the narrative? Is the purpose of the narrative from a good place? Perhaps. Does it work? Is it effective? Maybe not always as effective, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't continue to have the conversation. And I'll be very, again, transparent. I don't necessarily go out putting Black Lives Matter on everything that I post. I probably haven't used it ever. Do I believe it as a statement? Of course I do, because I believe both Black Lives Matter and All Lives Matter. I believe they're synonymous. Mm-hmm. And that's where, again, some people would say, well, you're trying to lower one or lower the other. No, my life matters. So whatever I am, that matters. So my culture, my race, my mother, my father, my brother, they matter. You don't have to put the Black on it to see that includes Black lives. Because if you love me, if you care about my life, you don't have to, that's the whole hashtag journalism, hashtag activism. I don't espouse to it at all. But I do make sure people see that when they see me and they talk to me, if I have to deal with this situation in the culture and you love me, then there should be an ability, as you're doing right now in this podcast, an ability to come to the table and say, let's talk this out. How can I either blend our perspectives or see where we might be in different odds and figure out how we can continue to make the human race better?